The planet was silent. Broken buildings lay scattered across the landscape, some of them half buried in sand. The sky was a dull gray, and the air was thick with dust. It had once been a thriving colony, full of life and energy. But now, everything was empty. There was no sound except the wind that swept across the barren land. In the center of the wreckage, a small group of alien girls huddled together. Their eyes were wide with fear, and their bodies were thin from hunger. They wore ragged clothes that barely covered their bodies. Their faces were dirty, their skin pale from days without sunlight. They had no food, no shelter, and no hope. The girls had once lived in a city, surrounded by their people. But that was before everything fell apart. Their world had been at war, and when the fighting grew worse, their people left. They abandoned their city, their homes, and most importantly, the girls. Now, they were alone. They didn't know how to survive on their own. They were young, scared, and unprepared for life without help. Every night was a nightmare, filled with the sounds of wild creatures outside their shelter, looking for food. The girls stayed close together, hoping that one day someone would come for them. But they knew deep down that no one would come. No one ever did. The youngest girl, a small alien with bright blue eyes, stared out at the empty city from the shelter. She thought she saw something moving in the distance, but it was just a shadow. She had hoped for a moment that someone was coming to rescue them. But the truth was clear. They were forgotten. Meanwhile, in space above the planet, a human soldier was getting ready to land. The soldier's name was Marcus. He was a part of a rescue mission sent by the Human Federation. His job was to investigate strange signals coming from the planet below. The Federation had received reports that the planet's colony had fallen silent, and no one knew why. They feared that it was another attack from the alien forces, but they had no way of knowing for sure. Marcus had seen war. He had fought in many battles, been to many dangerous places, and had even lost friends. But nothing prepared him for what he was about to find on this planet. He had no idea what to expect, but he was ready for anything. He landed his small ship in a cleared area near the ruined city. The ship's engines shut off with a quiet hum, and Marcus stepped out. He looked around at the wreckage, his heart heavy. This was supposed to be a thriving world. Where was everyone? There was no sign of life, no movement anywhere. He reached for his scanner and began scanning the area. The machine beeped quietly as it picked up strange readings. There was a faint signal coming from deeper within the ruins. Someone, or something, was alive down there. Marcus carefully made his way toward the signal, keeping his gun close, ready for anything. He had learned the hard way not to trust appearances. Just because a place seemed abandoned didn't mean it was safe. As he walked through the ruins, he noticed something strange. There were signs of life here, small footprints in the dust, torn pieces of fabric caught on sharp edges, broken tools left behind. He followed the trail, slowly, until he reached an old building that looked like it might have been a shelter. And that's when he saw them. The girls were huddled together, hiding in the corner of the ruined structure. They didn't notice Marcus at first, too focused on their own survival. He could see their fear, their uncertainty. They didn't know who he was or what he wanted. They had been alone for so long, they couldn't trust anyone anymore. Marcus stood still for a moment, unsure of what to do. He knew that these girls needed help, but how could he earn their trust when they had been abandoned by everyone else? How could he protect them when they had no reason to believe in him? His first move was simple. He knelt down slowly, so as not to frighten them. He placed his gun on the ground, showing them that he wasn't a threat. Then he pulled out a small packet of food from his backpack. He opened it carefully, showing them the contents: dried fruit and some protein bars. He held it out toward them. At first, the girls didn't move. They just stared at him, wide-eyed. The smallest one, the one with the blue eyes, was the first to make a move. She stepped forward cautiously, reaching out with trembling hands. She took the food from him, but her eyes never left his face. She was still unsure. Marcus smiled gently, hoping to calm them. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly, though he knew they couldn't understand his words. But his tone was kind, and that was enough for now. The girls slowly gathered around him, still afraid but desperate for food. They took the small offering, sharing it among themselves. Marcus watched them carefully, his heart aching for them. They had been left behind, forgotten by everyone, but not by him. He made a silent promise to himself that he would protect them, no matter what. He wouldn't let them stay alone any longer. As the girls ate, Marcus began to plan his next move. He had to find a way to keep them safe, to get them off this planet. But first, he needed to earn their trust. It wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. The girls, for the first time in days, felt a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they thought. First meeting. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the ruined city. The once bustling streets were now empty, filled with dust and silence. The air was heavy, and the wind blew softly through the broken buildings. It had been a long day for Marcus, the human soldier, and the alien girls. Marcus had stayed with the girls for hours, offering them food and water. They had barely spoken, and they didn't seem to trust him yet. He knew he had to earn their trust. They had been hurt by others before, and now they were afraid of anyone who might come near. It was clear they didn't believe that he was there to help them. The smallest girl, the one with blue eyes, kept watching him from a distance. She would glance at him when she thought he wasn't looking, but she quickly looked away whenever their eyes met. The others were no different. They kept their distance, their eyes wide with fear and curiosity. Marcus understood. They were alone, and they had been abandoned by their people. Who could blame them for being afraid? He thought about his own time in war, how trust had been something that didn't come easily. But for now, he could only be patient. Patience was something he was good at. He sat on a broken piece of metal, leaning against the wall. The girls stayed close to one another, huddled together for warmth. They watched him, but said nothing. The silence between them felt heavy, like the air before a storm. Marcus sighed softly and looked down at the food they had shared earlier. He couldn't leave them like this, but he didn't know how to reach them. How could he convince them he wasn't their enemy? Suddenly, one of the girls, the oldest, with long green hair, stepped forward. She held something in her hands. It was small and wrapped in cloth. She approached Marcus, her steps slow and hesitant. Her eyes were filled with doubt, but there was something else too, hope. She wasn't sure what to think of him, but she was taking a chance. Marcus looked up, surprised. He didn't want to make any sudden movements, so he stayed still. He smiled at her gently, trying to show that he meant no harm. "You can come closer," he said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand him. His voice was calm, and he made sure not to look threatening. The girl stopped a few feet away, still clutching the wrapped bundle in her hands. She looked at him, then at the others, who were watching from the shelter. They looked at each other, as if waiting for something to happen. The girl took another step forward, then another. Slowly, she approached Marcus, her feet barely making a sound on the dusty ground. When she reached him, she held out the bundle. Marcus stared at it for a moment, unsure of what it was. He didn't want to seem rude, so he reached out slowly, accepting it from her hands. He carefully unwrapped the cloth, revealing a small, fragile alien fruit. It was bright red, with a sweet smell that filled the air. It was something he had never seen before, but it looked important to her. He smiled, even though he didn't know what to say. "Thank you," he said softly, hoping his tone would convey his gratitude. The girl didn't smile back, but her posture relaxed a little. She nodded once, then stepped back. Marcus sat there for a moment, looking at the fruit. It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. They were offering him something they had, something precious. It was their way of saying that they trusted him, even if it was only a little. The other girls watched the exchange with interest. They had seen what had just happened, and it seemed like they were starting to believe that maybe this human wasn't as dangerous as they had first thought. The smallest girl, the one with the blue eyes, took a few steps forward. She was still nervous, but she was curious now. She looked at Marcus, her wide eyes filled with wonder. Slowly, she reached out her hand, offering him a small piece of the dried fruit they had eaten earlier. It was a simple gesture, but it meant a lot to Marcus. She was trusting him, just as the older girl had. Marcus took the fruit from her hand, smiling warmly. "Thank you," he said, feeling a small sense of victory. The girl didn't respond, but she didn't pull away either. She stood there, watching him closely. It was clear she was still unsure, but something had changed. She was starting to accept him. The other girls, seeing the trust between Marcus and the smaller one, began to move closer. One by one, they slowly approached him, hesitant but willing to give him a chance. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes, but he could also see the hope that was beginning to grow. They wanted to believe he was there to help them, but they had been hurt before. They were afraid of being let down again. "Don't worry," Marcus whispered, more to himself than to them. "I'm not going anywhere." He knew he couldn't promise them everything, but he could promise this: he would never leave them behind. For the first time since his arrival, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the soldier and the alien girls sat together, silently sharing the night. Though they still had a long way to go, they no longer felt completely alone. In this ruined world, they had found each other. Survival lessons. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the ruins. The air was still, and the dust that filled the streets seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. For Marcus, the new day felt like a chance to start fresh. He had earned a small amount of trust from the alien girls, but now he had to prove that he could protect them, help them survive. Marcus knew the first step was to teach them how to live in this harsh world. They had been surviving by sheer luck, but luck wouldn't last forever. They needed real skills if they were going to stay alive. The girls were still nervous. They watched Marcus closely, but none of them spoke. They didn't seem to understand his words, but they understood his actions. He could see the fear and curiosity in their eyes. They were learning to trust him, little by little. Marcus stood up and dusted himself off. The ruins around them were filled with dangers. Dangerous creatures roamed the land, and the environment was unforgiving. The girls had to learn how to protect themselves. He gestured for them to follow him and led them out of their shelter. The ground beneath their feet was hard and cracked. Small patches of dry grass grew in places, and the once beautiful trees had turned into twisted, leafless shapes. "Stay close," Marcus said, even though they couldn't understand his words. He made sure to keep his tone calm and reassuring. The girls followed, their footsteps light and hesitant. The blue-eyed girl stayed close to Marcus, her curious gaze never leaving him. The others stuck together, watching the environment carefully. As they walked through the ruins, Marcus noticed several things. First, there were no signs of other survivors. The colony was abandoned, completely empty. The buildings were falling apart, and nature was slowly reclaiming everything. But more importantly, there were signs of wild creatures. He spotted fresh tracks on the ground, large, clawed footprints that belonged to a creature the girls would need to avoid. It was one of the dangerous predators that roamed the planet. Marcus pointed to the tracks and made a low noise in his throat. He wanted to show the girls what to look for. The blue-eyed girl tilted her head, watching him. She seemed to understand that these tracks meant danger. Marcus crouched down and began to gather some small rocks and sticks. He was showing them how to make simple tools, things that could be used for protection, for gathering food, or for building a shelter. The girls watched closely, their eyes following every movement. They didn't say anything, but Marcus could feel their attention on him. He stood up and handed one of the sticks to the older girl with green hair. He pointed at a nearby tree and mimicked the motion of hitting something. The girl hesitated, then took the stick in her hand. She swung it lightly at the tree, as Marcus had shown her. It was clumsy at first, but she tried again, this time with more strength. The others watched and nodded, impressed. Marcus smiled, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The girls were learning, slowly but surely. They had no experience with survival, but they were eager to learn. Next, Marcus led them to a nearby stream. The water was clear, but he knew better than to drink it without testing it first. He knelt down and dipped a small piece of cloth into the water, then squeezed it into his hands. He showed the girls how to filter the water by placing it through the cloth. They watched, copying his actions. The girls' hands were shaky at first, unsure of what they were doing, but after a few tries, they began to get the hang of it. Marcus kept his movements slow and steady, showing them how to make sure the water was safe to drink. He explained, though he knew they couldn't understand him, by pointing at the water and tapping his stomach, showing that clean water would help them stay strong. As they worked together, the girls seemed to relax a little. They were no longer watching him with the same fear. Instead, they looked at him as a guide, someone they could follow. Slowly, the smallest girl with blue eyes smiled at him for the first time. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough to show that she was starting to trust him. After filling their water containers, Marcus led them to the next lesson, finding food. He showed them how to recognize edible plants, pointing to certain bushes and fruits that grew in the wild. Some of the plants were small, some were bigger, but all of them had to be carefully picked. He demonstrated how to pluck the fruit gently, making sure not to destroy the plants. The girls watched and copied him, their fingers still unsure, but more confident with every step. Marcus smiled as they worked. The lessons weren't easy, but they were making progress. Each small step brought them closer to survival. After a while, Marcus noticed that the girls were more comfortable. They were no longer staying in the shadows or flinching every time he moved. They were helping each other, pointing out the right plants or making small improvements on their tool-making skills. There was less fear in their eyes now, and that made Marcus feel like he was doing something right. As the sun began to set again, Marcus gathered the girls around the fire he had made. He didn't have much to cook, but they had some fruit and small roots they had found during the day. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them fed for the night. The girls sat quietly around the fire, eating slowly, and Marcus sat with them, watching the flames dance. It had been a long day, but he could see the progress they had made. They were no longer helpless, lost in the ruins. They were learning how to survive, how to live again. He looked at them, one by one, his heart full of determination. They still had a long way to go, but they were no longer alone. Together, they would survive. The beast attack. The following day dawned bright and clear. The air was warmer than usual, and the distant sound of the wind brushing against the barren trees echoed through the ruins. Marcus, now fully in charge of the girls' safety, had planned to continue their survival lessons. But today would be different. He could feel it in the air. Something was coming. The girls had grown more comfortable with their daily routines. They were getting better at finding food, making tools, and gathering water. Marcus was proud of them. Slowly but surely, they were becoming stronger and more confident. But just as they were settling into their new life, a low growl broke the silence. Marcus froze. The girls, sensing his sudden tension, stopped what they were doing. The blue-eyed girl looked up at him, eyes wide with fear, as the others turned in the direction of the noise. Marcus didn't need to see the creature to know what it was. He had heard stories from his training back on Earth, tales of wild beasts that roamed the planet, fierce and relentless. The growl was too deep, too guttural, to belong to anything less than a predator. He motioned for the girls to stay close and moved to the front of the group, his heart pounding in his chest. His hand instinctively reached for the makeshift spear he had crafted earlier, a long stick with a sharp rock tied to the end. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The sound of the growling grew louder, closer. Marcus crouched low, scanning the area. His sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement through the tall, dead grass. Something large, something dark, was moving toward them. He could see the creature's glowing eyes, hungry and predatory, scanning for prey. The beast was huge, easily as tall as a man, but it was built like a monster. A thick body covered in dark, matted fur, claws like daggers, and a wide mouth filled with sharp teeth. Its eyes were glowing a fierce red, scanning the area like it was hunting. Marcus's heart raced as the beast charged toward them with terrifying speed. "Run," he shouted. The girls screamed in terror and scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with fear. The blue-eyed girl grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him back, but he knew they couldn't outrun the creature. It was too fast. With no time to think, Marcus swung his spear at the beast, hoping to stop it in its tracks. The creature howled, a deep, guttural sound that shook the ground beneath them. But it didn't stop. It lunged forward, its claws aimed directly for Marcus. The spear connected, but the beast barely flinched. It roared in anger, knocking Marcus aside with one swipe of its massive paw. He hit the ground hard, gasping for breath as pain shot through his side. "Marcus!" the blue-eyed girl cried, her voice full of panic. She moved toward him, but Marcus quickly grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "Stay back," he shouted, trying to push her to safety. The beast turned toward them, its mouth dripping with saliva as it prepared to strike again. Marcus's mind raced. There was no way they could fight it head-on. He had to think of something, and fast. Suddenly, a plan formed in his mind. He noticed the nearby trees, their thick branches low to the ground. They might not be able to outrun the beast, but they could use the trees to their advantage. "Climb," Marcus shouted, pointing to the trees. The girls hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but the growl of the beast pushed them into action. They scrambled toward the nearest tree, their hands shaking with fear. Marcus quickly stood up, his spear in hand, and turned to face the beast again. It was coming closer, its claws digging into the ground as it prepared to leap at him. Without thinking, Marcus tossed his spear into the air, distracting the creature for a split second. It paused, its eyes locking onto the weapon, giving Marcus just enough time to sprint toward a nearby tree. The blue-eyed girl was already climbing, her small hands grasping the branches as she pulled herself higher. The other girls followed, scrambling up the tree with surprising speed. Marcus was right behind them. He climbed quickly, his heart racing as he felt the beast's hot breath on the back of his neck. He was almost to the top when he heard the creature's roar behind him. It wasn't far away now. The beast leaped toward the tree, its claws reaching for Marcus. But just as it got close, the branches above them snapped under its weight. The creature's roar turned to a growl of frustration as it realized it couldn't reach them. Marcus breathed a sigh of relief, but the danger wasn't over. The beast was still circling the base of the tree, waiting for them to come down. They couldn't stay up there forever. "We need a plan," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. The girls looked down at the creature, their faces filled with fear, but there was a new sense of determination in their eyes. They had survived the first attack, but they knew they couldn't let their guard down. They were learning to fight back. As the beast continued to pace below them, Marcus kept his eyes on it. He knew they had to find a way to outsmart it. If they didn't, they would be stuck in the tree, waiting for something to change. And waiting wasn't an option. The blue-eyed girl, sitting beside Marcus, tugged on his sleeve. She didn't speak, but her eyes were full of determination. She pointed to the creature, then to the higher branches of the tree. "Climb higher?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded. It was clear she had an idea. With a deep breath, Marcus stood up, ready to move. The girls were scared, but they were starting to trust him. Together, they would make it through this. Marcus smiled at her, trying to reassure her. "No need to thank me. We're all in this together. The group continued, moving cautiously, stopping every so often to check their surroundings. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was the only one who knew how to survive in this world. The girls had no experience with the dangers they faced, but they had something he didn't: hope. They hadn't given up, even after everything they had been through. As the day wore on, the forest began to change. The trees thinned out, and the ground became less uneven. They had reached the edge of the woods, but as they emerged from the trees, Marcus's heart sank. In the distance, he saw what they had been hoping for: the village. But it wasn't a peaceful place. Smoke rose from the buildings, and figures moved in and out of the structures. It didn't look like a place of safety. The blue-eyed girl stood beside him, her hand on his arm. "What is that?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Marcus didn't have an answer. "We need to be careful," he said. "Something isn't right." They had made it this far, but now they faced an even greater challenge. The village, which should have been a beacon of hope, might just be another danger waiting to consume them. The final battle. The air was thick with tension as Marcus and the girls approached the village. The smoke in the sky grew darker, and the sounds of movement echoed around them. It wasn't a peaceful settlement. Something was off. Marcus's senses were on high alert. He knew this was no ordinary village. They had no choice but to push forward. "Stay close," Marcus whispered, motioning for the girls to follow him. They stayed silent, their eyes wide with worry, but they trusted him. They had no other choice. As they walked closer, the shadows grew deeper, and the smell of smoke and metal filled the air. The village seemed deserted, but Marcus could tell something was wrong. There were no children playing, no animals roaming the streets, and no sign of any normal life. The girls were growing more uneasy with every step. The blue-eyed girl, the one who had always been the most brave, was now looking around nervously. "What is this place?" she asked in a quiet voice. "I don't know," Marcus replied, his eyes scanning the area. "But we're about to find out." The village seemed abandoned, but as they rounded a corner, they found themselves face to face with a group of people, humans, just like Marcus. They were armed, wearing heavy gear, and they stared at him with cold eyes. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, no one moved. "You're not supposed to be here," one of them said, his voice low and threatening. Marcus stepped forward, his heart racing, but his face calm. "I'm here to get the girls out of here. We don't want any trouble." But the leader of the group, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, smirked. "Trouble? No, but you've just stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time." Before Marcus could react, the leader gave a signal, and the group lunged forward. The girls gasped, backing away, but Marcus was ready. He grabbed the nearest weapon, a staff from the ground, and swung it with practiced precision, knocking the first attacker to the ground. The leader's smirk faded as he watched Marcus fight. He had underestimated him. Marcus was quick, his movements sharp and calculated. Every strike had purpose, every movement designed to disarm, not kill. He wasn't here to cause chaos. He was here to protect the girls. But the group didn't back down. They came at him from all sides, forcing him to fight harder. He blocked an attack from the left, spun around, and kicked another assailant in the chest, sending him sprawling. The girls watched in shock, unable to understand everything that was happening but knowing it was a fight for their survival. The blue-eyed girl looked at Marcus, her eyes filled with fear, but also something else: admiration. She had always seen him as their protector, but now she saw him as their savior. "We need to get out of here," she shouted to the others. But the battle wasn't over. Marcus was still fighting, and the attackers weren't giving up. More of them charged at him, their weapons raised. But Marcus was ready. He threw his staff forward, knocking one man out cold, and then kicked another in the side, sending him into the dirt. The blue-eyed girl grabbed one of the fallen weapons and handed it to Marcus. "Use this," she cried, Marcus nodded and took the weapon, a simple knife. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. He slashed at the nearest attacker, using the knife with deadly precision. Each strike was calculated, and he moved quickly, like a blur, avoiding the blows and landing his own with quick precision. But even with all his training, he couldn't fight forever. The numbers were against him, and his strength was fading. The girls nodded, their faces showing both fear and hope. They had been through so much, and now the end seemed in sight. But Marcus knew they weren't safe yet. They had to reach the rescue point, an old outpost hidden deep in the forest, where help was waiting for them. Suddenly, one of the girls, a small green-skinned alien with large black eyes, stumbled and fell. "I can't go any further," she whispered, tears in her eyes. Marcus immediately crouched down beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You're going to be okay. Just a little longer, all right?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and trust. "But what if they come after us?" Marcus gripped her hand tightly. "They won't catch us. I'll make sure of it." With a soft grunt, he helped the girl to her feet. They couldn't afford to slow down. Every second counted. The enemy might still be after them, and the forest offered only temporary cover. Marcus's mind raced as he scanned the trees, his thoughts constantly calculating their next move. "Let's keep moving," he urged, and the group pressed on, the distant sound of their pursuers growing fainter with each step. As they traveled deeper into the forest, the girls began to regain some of their strength. Their steps were less heavy, their breathing less frantic. But the fear still lingered in their eyes. They had been through so much, and the trauma would take time to heal. Marcus could see it in the way they clung to each other, in the way they looked to him for reassurance. "We're almost there," Marcus repeated, his voice steady despite the weariness in his body. His training as a soldier had taught him to remain calm, no matter the situation. But he couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. These girls, these innocent lives, had been through more than anyone should have to endure, and it was up to him to get them to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the outpost. It was a small, hidden base, tucked between two large hills and surrounded by thick trees. A few lights flickered in the distance, and a faint hum of machinery buzzed in the air. This was their safe haven. As they approached, a figure emerged from the shadows. A man, tall and lean, with short-cropped hair and a rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked at Marcus and the girls with a stern but welcoming gaze. "You made it," the man said, his voice calm but full of relief. "We were starting to think you wouldn't." Marcus gave him a tight nod. It was close. "We need to move fast. Are the transport ships ready?" The man, who introduced himself as Lieutenant Rourke, glanced over his shoulder, checking the status of the base. "The ships are prepped, but there's something we need to take care of first." Before Marcus could respond, Rourke turned to the girls, his face softening. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." The girls, exhausted and bruised, barely registered his words. They were too tired to speak, too emotionally drained to do anything but stand there, their eyes wide with a mix of relief and disbelief. It was hard for them to believe they were finally safe. Rourke led them into the base, where they were given food and medical attention. Marcus stood by, watching as the girls were cared for, his mind still alert, constantly on guard. He had done what he promised. They were out of danger, but he knew the journey wasn't over. The base was small, but it was well hidden, and there were enough supplies to keep them safe for a while. Rourke explained that the transport ships would be ready to take them to a larger safe zone soon, where they could finally start a new life. Marcus found a quiet corner and sat down, allowing himself a moment of rest. His body ached, and his mind was tired, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. He had done it. He had saved them. They were free. As the girls gathered around the small table, their faces still uncertain, Marcus walked over to them. They looked up at him, their eyes filled with gratitude, but also confusion. "What happens now?" the blue-eyed girl asked softly. Marcus smiled gently. "Now, you get to live. You get to be free. You can start over." The blue-eyed girl smiled back, her eyes bright with hope for the first time in a long while. The other girls, too, looked at him with new confidence. They were no longer just survivors. They were warriors, too, thanks to Marcus. As the transport ships began to power up outside, the girls stood together, holding hands, ready to move forward into their new life. The road ahead would be long, and there would be challenges, but for the first time in their lives, they knew they weren't alone. And as they boarded the ships, leaving the dangers of the planet behind, Marcus stood at the entrance, watching them go. They had a chance at a new beginning. And that was all that mattered. For Marcus, it was the beginning of a new chapter too. A chapter where he could finally rest. A chapter where he had fulfilled his mission. And most importantly, a chapter where he knew that he had helped create something beautiful, hope.